I'm pleased to have the opportunity to welcome Miran Gul to the Mackinder Forum. Mr. Gul is the author of The New Geography of Innovation, the recipient of the Financial Times McKinsey Bracken Bauer Prize, and an FT Best Book of the Year selection. He was previously at the World Economic Forum and attended Yale, where he was a Fulbright Scholar, Fox International Fellow, and a Teaching Fellow. He lives in Switzerland. The title of today's talk is The New Geography of Innovation, the Global Contest for Breakthrough Technologies. And with that, I would say take it away.
Thank you, Michael, and Dr. Hochberg for inviting me to this forum. So I think before I start with the presentation itself, I wanted to just say a couple of words about why this topic is important. Any casual reader of the news today would see fragments of what I'm talking about in the news virtually every day, whether it is people reading about DeepSeek and how last year it wiped over $1 trillion in market cap from American tech stocks last year, to things such as the politics around semiconductors, to things like Chinese EVs not being allowed into the US. So this is a topic that you would be familiar with in fragments. And the attempt that I'm going to try and make over here is to try and explain how this picture comes together more cohesively. And my contention overall is that competition among nations, if in the past happened by way of militaries and by way of economic competition, I think increasingly now competition in private companies and competition among nations when it comes to new technologies is becoming more and more salient. And in the words of John Thornhill, who is the FT's tech editor, he recently wrote that if national sovereignty in the 20th century was magnified by military hardware, tanks, battleships, nuclear missiles, it is increasingly now empowered by civilian software, intellectual property, data, and computer code. So that is really the framing for what is going to follow over the next 50 minutes to an hour. And I'd like to start this presentation with a book that came out about 7 years ago, 8 years, in 2018. Alan Greenspan, who was the chair of the Federal Reserve, along with Adrian Woolridge, who spent quite a lot of time at The Economist, came out with a book, Capitalism in America. The basic purpose of the book was to do a survey of trying to understand why is it that the US has stood head and shoulders above its European and Asian competitors when it comes to measures of economic performance. And the conclusion was somewhat pessimistic, where they concluded that if you look at any measure of creative destruction, from geographic mobility to company creation to tolerance of disruption, and you see that it's headed downwards. The US is becoming indistinguishable from mature, slow growth economies such as Europe and Japan in its handling of creative destruction. And this pessimism around the US's ability to compete in new technologies is something that we see in the news fairly frequently. And I'll sort of come to that a little bit later in the presentation. And so I read that book and I thought, this is something that is worth sort of closer examination. Is it really true that the US is, at least in the realm of new technologies, in decline? And if it is, then who is ascendant? Is there something out there that goes beyond the US-China binary? And before I go into my sort of broader findings, I'll maybe start with two vignettes, which I think in very vivid terms demonstrate some of the changes that we're seeing in the world out there. And the first story is about AI research. What you have in front of you is a paper called Deep Residual Learning for Image Recognition. It's a paper that's also called ResNet. It came out of a lab in Beijing in 2015. Within a span of about 10 years, the ResNet paper has gathered over 250,000 citations on Google Scholar. This one paper is the most cited paper in artificial intelligence anywhere in the world. it is also the most cited paper in all of computer science anywhere in the world. It is, in fact, the most cited paper in any academic field published in the 21st century, across all science, math, physics, biology, across all science. This is the most cited paper and well on its way to becoming the most cited paper ever. And what you have in front of you are the 10 most cited papers of the 21st century. And this is not my research. This is Nature published this earlier last year. And so the four authors that published this paper, the interesting thing about them is that prior to publishing their landmark paper, they virtually had no exposure to the Western world. All of them got their undergraduate, graduate, and PhD degrees in China. None of them had worked or studied outside of China prior to publishing their paper, and all of them have won other major awards and recognitions other than ResNet. And the two, sort of the four names in front of you, the first name in there, Kai-Ming He, he is now a professor at MIT. He's also a distinguished fellow at DeepMind. And the third name that you see in there, Jian Sun, he passed away recently, but prior to that, he was under active sanctions by 3 different government agencies in the US. And I think that really sort of captures the ambivalence with which the wider world often looks at China's rise in science in general and AI in specific. The fact that, 2 scientists, both of them part of the same team, both of them published the same landmark paper, but one is almost feted in the US, whereas the other was under active sanctions. And my point about the ResNet paper is that this is not, nobody got lucky here. This is not an exception. If you look at the 100 most cited papers in AI, China's share in these papers grew from 33 in 2021 to 41 in 2024. And China's contribution to AI output in general has been on the increase. And we can see that in the numbers here. What you have in front of you are the 5 most prestigious AI conferences in the world. And you can see the share of papers accepted to these conferences with at least one China-based researcher. And with numbers as modest as 8% 10 years ago, we can now see that Chinese researchers contribute up to a half of all papers contributed to these top-tier AI conferences. And I think this also illustrates my wider point, which is if, without showing you the slide, I were to have asked you what percentage of top-tier AI research comes from China, maybe you would have said 20%, maybe you would have said 25%. But I doubt that your guess would have been that up to a half of all top-tier research is coming from China. And that, I think, illustrates a wider point that perceptions about China in technology often lag reality by about 5 years. And that's not just true in AI research. That is true for a number of different domains in technology. Like, for instance, if you look at electric vehicles, 7 out of 10 EVs are manufactured in China, which is a fact that maybe an average consumer in the US might not be that familiar with because there aren't that many Chinese EVs on the roads. But if you go to places like Norway, for instance, you go to places like Central Asia, you will see them almost everywhere. This is a graph from The Economist from about a month ago. This takes just one of the most prominent AI conferences, which is NeurIPS. If there's one AI conference out there which sort of stands above the rest, it would be NeurIPS, also often called the Woodstock of AI. And as of last year, China contributes more papers to NeurIPS that were accepted there than the US. And you can see over time, over the past 10 years, how that pecking order has reconfigured from China going from in 4th place to now essentially being in 1st place when it comes to their papers being accepted. If you look at the same idea of where top-level papers in AI are coming from. This graph is from Stanford's AI Index report. It looks at the top 15 institutions that contribute papers that are the most cited papers in AI, the top 100 publications. 10 of these institutions across both private sector and public sector, across both academia and the private sector. 10 of these institutions are Asian, 9 of them are Chinese. And these include institutions like Peking University, Tencent, and the rest. Anyone who's in AI would be very familiar with the face in front of you. This is Dr. Geoffrey Hinton. Much of the reason why we went from not hearing about AI at all, if you go back 5 years, 6 years, for instance, virtually nobody was talking about artificial intelligence. And this boom really happened over the past 4 years. And there are many people who are responsible for bringing AI into the mainstream. But if you were to name one person, it would be Dr. Hinton, who wrote the original AlexNet paper from 2012, which laid the foundation for deep learning and neural networks, which is the basis for most AI systems that we see in the world today. He's a Turing Award winner. He's a Nobel Prize laureate. The interesting fact there being that there is no Nobel Prize in computer science, but such was the scale of his achievement that they gave him one anyway, this time in physics. And I had a chance to interview Dr. Hinton, and the conversation invariably went in the direction of which country do you think is going to lead in AI? And his answer was that just given the sheer quantity and quality of research coming from the country, his bet was on China. And I think the wider point that this illustrates is that we often maybe think about what's coming from China as copycat innovation or something that's happening only at the top layer of products and services. But there's often a comfortable assumption that when it comes to frontier research or when it comes to basic science, that somehow China is lagging. But this module was really to illustrate that mental model is outdated. And we, in frontier disciplines, are seeing a lot of path-breaking research at the foundational level that is also coming from that country. The first sort of story that I mentioned was about research. The second one focuses more on industry, which is more about the applications of that research. And here I'd like to talk a little bit about the battery industry. I think batteries are quite important because of all the things that have been called the new oil, this is probably the most literal analog, where if the foundation of our economy is progressively being swapped out with replacing fossil fuels with lithium-ion batteries, then this is a very strategic technology for the future. What you have in front of you are the top 10 battery manufacturers in the world. This is perhaps a unique industry in the sense that it is almost entirely captured by one region. Something like 6 of the top 10 are Chinese, 3 are Korean, and 1 is Japanese. It's a $150 billion industry where the major players are almost all entirely Asian at this point in time. And it's not because others have not tried to compete. Back in 2016 in Sweden, there was a company called Northvolt that came up, which was launched by former Tesla executives. Northvolt was at one point both the highest funded and the highest valued startup to come out of Europe. It was the big European bet to own a certain segment of the future of the car. If you look at the past 50 years, much of the foundation of European prosperity has depended on the automotive industry. If you look at companies like places like Germany, for instance, this would be companies like Mercedes, Audi. If you look at Italy, it would be the high-end manufacturers like Maserati, Ferrari. If you look up in Sweden, it'll be brands like Volvo. So the automotive industry has played an outsized role in European industry. And with the rise of Asian players, there was a lot of anxiety in Europe that they're losing their grip on this important industry. And so Northvolt was a major bet that Europe was making on owning a future of the car. Volkswagen owned about 20% of the company. It was backed by everything from the European Investment Bank to Goldman Sachs to BMW. I had a chance to interview the founders of Northvolt back in 2020. And in my view, I asked them what their ambition was here. And they described their ambition as owning 25% of the entire supply of lithium-ion batteries in Europe, which to me seemed like a perfectly achievable objective. Only a quarter of the market of Europe. In one way, this would almost seem like modest ambitions, because if you look at American companies, for instance, their ambitions are always owning global market share. If you look at companies like SpaceX, for instance, their ambition can only be described as intergalactic. So if the most important startup in Europe is telling you that their entire ambition to have a quarter of the European market, that seemed like a very achievable objective. Last year, Northvolt filed for bankruptcy, and it didn't quite make it. And the reasons were quite simple, which is that Northvolt was basically a thin manufacturing layer on top of a Chinese supply chain that went 7 layers deep. So if battery packs are manufactured in China, if electrolytes are coming from China, if lithium refining is happening on that continent as well, that you can't enter on the very last level of manufacturing and try and win on that level. In other words, you cannot build a sovereign battery industry on top of a supply chain that is owned elsewhere. And Northvolt is maybe the only, Northvolt is only the most visible example of what has been one battery manufacturer after another going under in Europe. British Volt, which was a similar effort that started in the UK, also didn't quite make it. An Italian effort has, by all measures, stalled. France, Germany, and Italy have tried ACC, which has not quite worked out. Verkor is still unproven. So Northvolt is not the failure of one company. It is more like a structural failure that operates on the level of an industry. The interesting thing about lithium-ion batteries is that it is not a Chinese invention. Lithium-ion batteries were invented in Europe. The most prominent person in the invention of lithium-ion batteries was John Goodenough, who did much of his pioneering research at Oxford back in the 1980s. He's a winner of the Nobel Prize, the oldest winner of the Nobel Prize, which he won at the age of 97. And this, I think, sort of captures the thesis that I'm trying to sort of arrive at, which is that the country that invents is not always the country that wins the market. And lithium-ion batteries are a very, very vivid demonstration of that. And these are things that have been in the news very prominently recently, which has led to a lot of anxieties in the US about the positioning of Chinese players when it comes to not just the lithium-ion industry, but industries across the board. What you have in front of you is an article written by Raphael Reif, who is the president emeritus at MIT. The article sort of speaks for itself. America is losing the innovation race, why the future of science might be Chinese. This is as recent as 2 months ago. Another piece in the New York Times, I went to China to see its progress in AI. We can't beat it. That's Sebastian Mallaby, the author of both The Power Law and The Infinity Machine, and a former Obama-era official writing in the NYT also recently. I just returned from China. We are not winning. And again, as I mentioned in the beginning, these would be anxieties that people on this call would be very familiar with. And over the course of my book, I wanted to see if there is any merit to that. And if we can put any numbers on it, if there's any empirical foundation to this commentary that we have become so familiar with. In other words, is the center of gravity for where the most consequential developments in technology are taking place, moving from the US to other places? And at first, it does seem that that position might have some validity. The question of what is the most important company in the world can have many different answers. Is it NVIDIA? Is it OpenAI? But the fact that TSMC, a company based in Taiwan, can also credibly claim to be the most important company in the world gives you a sense of the sorts of changes that we're seeing out there. This is not a claim that could have been made 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 50 years ago. Similarly, it's not just about Asia. If you look at Spotify, which is a company based in Sweden, it is the most popular streaming service in the world. BYD, which is the company that most people on this call would not have been familiar with 5 years ago, now makes more EVs than the entire German car industry makes any kind of car, whether it's hybrid, gasoline, or EV. And so there are so many examples out there that sort of show that there is something fundamental that is going on out there. So how do you figure out, whether the map of innovation in the world is changing? In my book, I look at three different approaches. The first approach is to look at this question the way a venture capitalist would look at it, which is to simply look at where are the most valuable startups based. And if you were to simply look at the most valuable unicorns, this is what the map of the world looks like. The US still very comfortably at the top, then it's China, UK, Israel, India, and then sort of some very familiar countries. If I were to add another dimension to that, which are the places that are attracting the most funding for their startups, this is what the map of the most innovative places looks like. This is a useful sort of ordering, but I think one important limitation here is that, and most of the places where you look at what are the most innovative places in the world will in one way or another come back to who has the most unicorns. But one important limitation of this is that innovation doesn't just happen in new companies. It very often happens in old ones as well. At a time when NVIDIA is the most valuable company in the world, and its market value is now greater than the entire economies of Japan and India, it is very hard to make the argument that innovation only happens in new companies. NVIDIA at this point is over 30 years old. By American corporate standards, it's practically middle-aged. So to look at another dimension, what does the map of the world look like when we look at the cumulative market cap of both old and new tech companies? And again, you see the US still standing tall, then China, then Europe, and then really the rest of the world. And just to sort of not be vulnerable to the criticism that we're only looking at the question of innovation from a very narrow lens of valuations and venture dollars, I also thought that it's useful maybe to include an index that is published by the World Intellectual Property Organization, which looks at maybe 86 different indicators to rank the most innovative places in the world. And over here, they go beyond just looking at venture dollars to looking at things such as how many STEM graduates are coming out of your country, how many patents are being filed there, how many new inventions are coming from there. And then looked at this way, the world looks something like this, somewhat of an unorthodox list with places like Switzerland and Sweden on top, and the US sort of coming after that. My point here is that no matter how you slice this question, it does seem that predictions of American decline do seem to be vastly exaggerated. The US still, in most measures, is in the same place as it's found itself in for the past 50 years, which is more significant than all of the competition combined. And to go deeper into this, if we look simply just at one major area of technology, which is artificial intelligence, we still see that the US makes more AI startups than the rest of the world combined. And so what I found was not that the US is losing relevance, but more that we are not seeing a distribution of technological capability in other parts of the world. We are seeing more concentration in the US and specifically more concentration in the Bay Area. If you look at this slide, this shows you the market cap of all Gen AI companies in the world and the cities or the regions where they are concentrated in. 91% of global market cap of Gen AI companies is in the Bay Area. And these would be companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, Databricks, and all the others that you would already be familiar with. And it is this concentration that people who, if you don't look at the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, if you go and talk to people whose life is living and breathing technology, they will point out that we are seeing more consolidation in the Bay Area. This is a recent tweet by Paul Graham, who founded Y Combinator, the best known startup incubator in the world. And he noted on Twitter that, on X, that it's striking how concentrated the AI revolution is. Even though starting out, startups had spread worldwide in the past couple of decades, this wave of tech is concentrated in the Bay Area, as the last two big waves were, which would be the semiconductor and the internet. And specialist publications in tech do tend to make this observation. This is a recent piece from Rest of the World, which looks specifically at new technologies, noting that this is unprecedented. America's AI boom is leaving the rest of the world behind. And really, places like Europe haven't really been able to produce Anthropics and OpenAIs. And even in China, we're not really seeing companies of that scale. And just to emphasize the point that we're not just seeing consolidation globally, we're also seeing consolidation within the US, in the sense that things are moving more towards the Bay Area. This is also from the Stanford AI Index report. This shows in 2025, the amount of money that was invested in new companies in the US. You can see California clearly in the lead with $218 billion last year invested in tech companies. The second is Colorado with $20 billion. So California is 10 orders of magnitude higher. And the third on that list is New York. And California is outranking New York by 20 orders of magnitude. So the trend is towards more consolidation, not towards more democratization, whether it's in the US or globally. And you can see that in the performance of AI systems. Stanford also publishes a leaderboard for what are the most capable foundation models in the world. And as you can see, Anthropic is clearly still at the top. Then there's XAI. Sure, Chinese models like Alibaba and DeepSeek are there, but they're still underperforming their American counterparts by some margin. But I think there's nuance to this, and this is where I think the presentation sort of pivots, which is, in order to achieve these somewhat marginal gains, the US has had to vastly outspend all of its competitors. So if you look at 2025 and the amount of money that was invested in AI in the US versus the rest of the world, the US is orders of magnitude higher, not just more than the rest of the world combined, but more than multiples of the rest of the world combined. And this is where that nuance comes in. For 23x more of the cost, the US has only been able to get about 2.7% more in terms of marginal performance. And this is the important nuance that I wanted to point out, which is, for every marginal dollar that is spent, the marginal advantage is not a dollar. It's maybe 1 cent or 5 cents. And this is the important distinction that I think many of the analysts today are not making. And this is an important one. Recently, Stanford came out with a report which noted that with capability no longer a clear differentiator, competitive pressure is shifting towards cost, reliability, and real-world usefulness. In other words, this marginal performance does not matter that much if your competitor is delivering something that is marginally less capable, but able to deploy it at lower cost and in high volumes. And so the framing that I think that is happening in the world is not between who is creating high performance models, the US or China. It is more that one country is unquestionably dominating the frontier, and this would be the US, whereas the other country is much more fluent when it comes to deploying these new technologies in the real economy. And this is playing out not just in AI, but across many different technological domains. In this slide in front of you, you have perhaps what are some of the most consequential technologies that define the current era: EVs, 5G, mobile payments, solar, robots. the interesting thing about all of these technologies is that none of them were invented in China. But if you look at the scale of the adoption for all of these technologies, whether it's EVs, autonomous vehicles, robots, the scale of adoption in China is greater than the rest of the world combined. And this is something that the Chinese are very aware of. The face in front of you right now is Kai-Fu Lee. In the Chinese AI ecosystem, there are many important people, but if you were to name one, who's the most important person in China's AI ecosystem, it would have to be Kai-Fu. He was both the chairman of Microsoft in China and also the chairman of Google in China as well. He's the author of AI Superpowers, which is often cited as an authoritative book on the AI ecosystem on the mainland. And I had a chance to interview him recently. And he conceded completely that when it comes to new technologies, the invention is mostly happening in the US. Let's say 70% of new inventions are happening in the US. But he said, and I quote, that what's important is that once these technologies are written up and available on the internet or in papers, Chinese companies are more likely to run away with it with this engineering excellence. So they're not necessarily competing on the invention phase. They are competing on the deployment phase. In other words, what is often said is that the US is good at building ladders, but China is better at climbing them. There are so many different examples of this. Temu, which is the low-cost version of Amazon, was launched in 2022. By 2023, it was the most downloaded app in the US and the second most popular e-commerce site in the world. A year into its launch, its sales topped $5 billion. China went from having no high-speed rails to having twice as many high-speed rails as the rest of the world combined in less than a decade. Interesting fact about Kai-Fu, when I interviewed him, he told me that he was thinking about launching a company called 01 AI. And in the 6 months that it took me to write out the article about my interview, his company had gone from being sort of a germ of an idea in his mind to being worth $1 billion. So that's really how fast things are moving on the mainland. And my point there is that it's easy to maybe look down on deployment as being secondary to invention itself. Invention is something that takes creativity. It's something that takes being good at basic science. But I would contend that it is not secondary. It's a complementary form of innovation, which is expressed in implementation rather than discovery. There are so many inventions that is only when they reach scale that you are really able to see their economic impact. The smartphone, for instance, was an important invention. But once the adoption happens, that's what enables so many different business models to ride on top of that initial technical innovation. It's adoption of smartphones that allows you to have companies like Airbnb or Uber, for instance. So we can't really, the very sort of simplistic notion that you just need to be good at invention is maybe a misplaced idea. The competition really also needs to happen in the speed and scale of deployment as well, which is where really China has its strengths. In other words, going back to the initial thesis, the country that invents is not always the country that wins the market. Now, if you are even a casual follower of technology and how it's covered in mainstream news outlets, the question of how does AI competition play out is one that comes up fairly frequently. And I think instead of making predictions about the future, one way to maybe approach this would be to look at how did the last major platform shift happen, the last major technology that kind of redefined how people live. What is the current state of that? And arguably the last big major tech shift was when smartphones first came out. The first smartphone, I don't need to tell you, came out in Cupertino and back in 2007. It's been something like 20 years, 2 decades. And so enough time has passed for us to assess how did that major platform shift play out. So here's a classic example of a tech that was invented unquestionably in the US. 20 years later, this is what the global market share of smartphones looks like. Only about 1 in 5 smartphones sold in the world are manufactured by an American company. Then there's Samsung, and really most of the market, about 60%, belongs to Chinese players. And this becomes even more skewed when you look at emerging markets. So right now in front of you, you have the market share for smartphones on the African continent. And about half of all smartphones that are sold in Africa are manufactured by just one Chinese company, and that's Transsion, a company that you probably have never even heard about. And only about 1% of smartphones that are sold in Africa come from American manufacturers. The rest are Samsung, Xiaomi, Honor, and other companies. And so, this is not something that is limited only to the smartphone industry. If we were to move towards EVs, for instance, electric vehicles, again, the first EVs were manufactured in the US, very famously, Tesla being the first important company in this area. But what does the global market share of EVs look like today? BYD is the world's largest manufacturer of EVs. Then it's Tesla. And among the top 10, it is 7 Chinese manufacturers and 2 German and 1 American manufacturer. So again, another vivid demonstration of my thesis: the country that invents is not always the country that wins the market as well. And that is, I think, the dynamic that we need to be aware of when we talk about how new technologies like AI are going, and the competition in AI is going to play out in the future. This is a recent sort of piece from the Wall Street Journal. The CEO of Ford went to China to look at their EV industry, and he was quoted in the Wall Street Journal as saying that it's the most humbling thing that he had ever seen. He subsequently imported a Chinese EV for himself, the Xiaomi SU7, and that's the EV that he drives every day. And I think there's something symbolic in that. Ford is not just an iconic American car manufacturer, it's the world's first car manufacturer. And the fact that that same company, its CEO today, now goes to China and brings their EV back, which is the EV that he drives every day, shows you the sorts of changes that we are seeing, and precisely this frontier versus deployment dynamic that is playing out across different industries. And I think another reason why deployment is important is, if companies from one region really win markets, they get the power to define standards and they get the power to define systems. And competitors from other parts of the world might find it very hard to compete with them on that base layer. So a recent sort of piece in Rest of the World mentioned how Chinese EV standards are winning globally. And these standards are at the same time banned in the US, which raises the question, are American companies going to be able to produce software that is interoperable with EVs that are in vogue in places like Africa, in Central Asia, and in the Far East? So this is where the advantage of deployment really comes in. Another example being Singapore picking Alibaba's foundation models to run their new language models rather than the American competitors. So the competition really here is to define what standards are and which country develops the technology on top of which the infrastructure for third countries runs on. And that's defined not necessarily by who creates the better technology. That is defined by who creates the cheaper technology and rolls it out faster than the competition. Which brings me to the question of the competition for third geographies. Very often when we talk about tech, and I've noticed specifically in the US, it is framed primarily in terms of a competition between the US and China. But I think what's often underappreciated is how companies from these two places are also competing for market share in third geographies. And I'll illustrate this with a couple of examples. If you look at the graph in front, the ranking in front of you, these are the largest companies on the African continent. And this looks like the mix of industries here looks like what the mix of industries in the US would have looked like in the mid 20th century. It's mostly banks and metals manufacturers, communications companies. But at the very top is a company called Naspers. Now, I'm quite sure that nobody on this call, unless you're related to Africa in some way, would have heard about Naspers. So how is it that a company that most of us have never even heard about is the most valuable company on the entire African continent? Naspers has a very interesting backstory. Naspers is a 100-year-old business. And it's the main sort of pivot that happened in the company's history was back in 2001, where it invested $32 million in Tencent within the first 2 years of Tencent's founding for about 50% of a share in that company. Over time, Naspers' share in Tencent grew to about $200 billion. It is often called the best investment in the history of capitalism. At one point, Naspers was among the 100 most valuable companies in the world. It was a Fortune 100 company, based entirely on its investment in Tencent. The interesting thing about Naspers is that the value of its stock on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange is actually less than the value of its stake in Tencent. So the company itself, in fact, has negative value. And so the fact that the most valuable company on the entire continent of Africa is a company that does not do anything in and of itself, but merely owns a small share in a Chinese tech company, shows you both the scale of value that is being created in China, but at the same time, that in third geographies like Africa, most of the performance that we're seeing on the stock market is coming from these companies as well. And this is not just something that is limited to Africa, to just the African continent. If you look at ASEAN, which is a collection of 11 countries, which includes Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, ASEAN as a region has more people than all of Europe. It is the world's largest single free trade zone. The top 3 e-commerce marketplaces in the ASEAN region are Shopee, Lazada, and TikTok Shop. Shopee's founder was born in China. This is Forrest Li. Lazada is entirely owned by China. This is by the Alibaba Group. And TikTok Shop is a Chinese platform altogether. So all 3 of the main e-commerce marketplaces in the ASEAN region have some sort of connection to China. And it's not as if Western companies did not try to compete. Amazon has a presence there, but it doesn't really have any meaningful market share there. And even in ride hailing, for instance, it's a local company, Grab, that won out the market, and Uber had to exit the market altogether. And I wouldn't just like to sort of focus on how China is winning certain markets. The same is happening on the US side as well. If you look at the best known AI frontier labs in the world, these would be companies that you would be very familiar with: OpenAI, Anthropic, ByteDance, DeepMind. And even though DeepMind is named in the same breath as these other companies, it is different in one very important respect. While OpenAI and Anthropic are now both almost worth $1 trillion, and ByteDance is worth almost half of that, DeepMind was acquired for a fraction of that value, only about $500 million back in 2014, and is now essentially a division within an American tech company, which is Google. And had DeepMind been independent, it at this point would have been the most valuable company to come out of all of Europe. But now that value is accruing to the US. So my point is, this is not just happening between Africa and China or East Asia and China. This is also happening between Europe and the US as well, where there is a competition for companies coming up in third geographies, with the US and China both in fierce competition. The important thing about DeepMind, even though it is today considered one of the most consequential tech companies in the world, with even Dario Amodei, who is the founder of Anthropic, saying that he really looks up to Demis Hassabis, who founded DeepMind. The interesting thing about DeepMind is that it's not even among the top 10 acquisitions made by Google ever. And yet it may turn out to be its most consequential. Near the conclusion, I'd like to sort of mention what is at stake here, which also sort of leads to the wider sort of question of what does the map of innovation look like and where is most of the economic value accruing. If you look at the past 50 odd years, and if you look at who won the platform shift being, there are always all sorts of technologies that are being invented. But in the words of John Hennessy, the chairman of Google, there's always one killer app. There's one piece of technology that really defines the era. And this would be desktops in the 1970s, operating systems in the 80s, internet in the 90s, all the way through smartphones, social networks. And for the past 50, 60 years, one wave after the other, we've seen the US win one platform shift after the other, which has given the US enormous economic and by extension, political power in the world. It's only now that we're seeing that with AI, it's a bit of a coin toss where we are seeing sort of some frontier activity in the US, but China is competing when it comes to third markets very ferociously. And if we look at what the past sort of 8 platform shifts, the sorts of economic power that conferred to the US, I'd like to illustrate that with one figure. In front of you right now, you have the 10 most valuable companies in the US. First, to make one minor point, this also has companies that you maybe have never even heard about, like Micron Technologies, for instance. It's not a company that is mentioned in the same breath as companies like NVIDIA or Alphabet. And yet, even fairly like low profile companies like Micron are at this point worth almost $1 trillion. And that shows you sort of the amount of value that's being created still in the tech industry in the US. The combined market cap of just the top 10 American tech companies today is about $27 trillion. When numbers get very, very big, people tend to not have a very good sense of what they mean. So compared to the entire GDP of the top 10 economies in the world, just the top 10 American tech companies are worth more than the entire GDPs of every single country in the world, except the US itself. And that very much includes China as well. And, this is really to push back on the idea that was introduced in the beginning by both Alan Greenspan, by Raphael Reif, and all the others, this idea that the US is somehow in decline, because the numbers don't tell that story. If you look at 1990, the US share of global GDP was about a quarter, about 25%. If you look at 2026, the US share of global GDP is still 25%. China, in the meantime, has multiplied its share tenfold, going from 1.9% to 19%. China is growing, but not at the expense of the US. It is growing at the expense of other rich world economies, primarily those based in Europe. And the US is also growing at the expense of economies primarily based in Europe. What you have in front of you is a graph from The Economist, which shows US GDP as a percentage share of the G7, which is largely other European countries. And both in nominal and in real terms, US share of G7 GDP has been going up since 1980, not on its way down. And which sort of reinforces my initial contention that predictions of American decline, at least when it comes to new technologies, are vastly exaggerated. And the question is less who's winning, the US or China, because both of them are doing very well. The real losers in the current race are in Europe. There was a recent piece in the Wall Street Journal just about 3 weeks ago, which asked the question, what happens when Europeans find out how poor they are? Which pointed out things such as per capita income in places like France today is half that in the US. Other facts that illustrate this are things like in the UK, if you take out London, the rest of the UK is at this point in per capita terms poorer than every single state in the US. And why is that? I think this graph explains that in very vivid terms. In the beginning, I showed a graph that showed the number of papers that are accepted from different countries to NeurIPS, which is the most important AI conference in the world. And this graphic puts percentages on that sort of graph. So these are the percentages of papers contributed to NeurIPS by individual institutions, both academic and private sector as well. You can see one half, almost 50%, is coming from China. Around 40% is coming from the US. The main difference here being that Chinese research is happening primarily in academic institutions. That's why places like Tsinghua and Peking are right up there. In the US, it skews more towards private companies, Google and Meta being the most important ones. Asia has been rising with Asia minus China as well. And then in green, you really have geographical Europe. And EPFL and ETH are Swiss, and Oxford is British. So these three are not even in the EU. So this is geographical Europe, but political Europe is just this one, 1%, Technical University of Munich. And so if you ask the question, why is it that all the platform shifts are going to the US? Why is it that most of the economic value that is coming from new technologies is coming from is accruing to the US and now increasingly to China as well? A lot of the answer to that is right here. Only about 1% of groundbreaking research in AI is coming from political Europe. And you see downstream consequences of that. AI is an umbrella term that covers lots of different technologies, everything from how AI is applied in embodied robotics to how it's used to give you sort of better search results. But the headline battle in AI, we tend to always converge on how this is playing out when it comes to foundation models. The GPT-3s, the Opus 4.8s, the Mythoses. And if you look at 2025, this is again a graph by Stanford. 59 of the world's most important AI models came from the US. Then it was China, then South Korea, and then Europe's share in that is only 2 models compared to 59 from the US and 35 from China. And this shows trends over time where the US's share is on its way up. Chinese share has been sharply rising as well, but the European share has been on its way down. So my approach to the book really was not to sort of rely on secondary sources too much, because then you really have to rely too much on the sorts of headlines that I showed you earlier from mainstream news outlets. My idea really was to go and talk to the people who are making all of this happen, to see what is their felt experience when it comes to new technologies. And I had a conversation with a senior EU official, and the conversation moved towards what are the options that Europe has right now? Is the question of future technologies merely about choosing sides? Is it about granting China more market access and then taking a share of that? Is it about American companies winning the race for AI and the Europe making peace with that in the way that it has in the past 50 years? And in their view, they wanted to compete. In their view, it's not about values, in the sense that for them, it was not about choosing sides based on democratic or liberal values. For them, it was about power. And this is a very senior EU official. And their exact quote was that it's very striking that people realize that the last 2 platform shifts of internet and mobile created just a staggering amount of US soft and sometimes hard power. And I think there's a general recognition, Macron gets it, Starmer gets it, that AI looks to be a platform shift or technological shift on the same scale. And if Europe doesn't try and play, then it'll just exacerbate what we saw in the post-97, 98 era. And so a lot of the frictions that you've seen in the past year or two between the US and Europe on different sort of political questions, when it comes to technology, that is an additional fault line that we're looking at. And increasingly in Europe, we are seeing people ask out loud the question, should DeepMind be an American company? Should it be a division within Google? Should Hugging Face be based out of New York? Should UiPath be based out of the US as well? These are all high value companies that were incubated in Europe that are now based in the US. And I think in addition to all the geopolitical questions, the question of the relative share of new technologies and the companies that monetize them is going to be an additional fault line when it comes to the US and Europe. And so just to summarize, I think the question of is the US in decline? I don't think if you look at company valuations and where frontier technologies are being built, the numbers don't suggest that at all. But yes, it is true that you can invent all the new tech, but at the same time, lose market share in emerging markets and see the same dynamic that we are seeing in smartphones, for instance, or in EVs, for instance, which is even if they were invented in the US, China is the country that wins out deployment and wins out standard settings, and then American companies are shut out because their systems are simply not interoperable with the infrastructure that is in place in places like Africa and the Far East. I'd like to sort of end with this image. It's not just a provocative sort of image. There are numbers behind it. This is from a report called the Tortoise Global AI Index, which crunches something like 36 indicators to rank the most important countries in AI. And I think this is an interesting graph also in that I think if I were to, at the end of my 5-year sort of effort to try and map out the most important countries in the world when it comes to tech, this relatively narrow graph of trying to map out the most important countries in AI, I would say the same image applies to technologies more broadly as well. And I think people often look at the flag at the top, the US, to often assume that the world hasn't changed all that much in the past 50 years or the past 40 years. But if you take out just the top ranking country, the rank order after that has almost entirely changed in the past 25 years. If we were having this conversation in 1990, the second tier of this graph would be almost entirely European. It would be countries like Germany, it would be countries like Sweden, like France, for instance. And now there are more and more Asian players that are entering into the fray. And so as you look at this, I would like you to reflect on the sorts of changes that we've seen in the past 25 years and how different this graph could look within our own lifetimes in the next 2 decades or so. And so with that sort of provocative image, I'd like to sort of end my monologue and see if there are any questions. Thank you.